Welcome to this podcast by the Stockholm Environment Institute, SEI, an international non-profit research and policy organisation that tackles environment and development challenges. With 8 centres spread across 5 continents, we connect science and decision-making to develop solutions for a sustainable future for all. This special mini-series focuses on the upcoming 28th UN Climate Change Conference, COP28. The episodes are based on the 3 pillars of the Paris Agreement: mitigation, adaptation, and finance. I am your host, Katie Harris, Senior Policy Fellow at SEI. COP28 takes place at a pivotal moment in history when the world stands at a midpoint. 7 years since the Paris Agreement was signed, and 7 years to 2030 when it comes to an end. This podcast critically analyses our progress so far and poses the vital question: are we on track to deliver the ambitious goals of the Paris Accord by 2030? Welcome to the 3rd episode of this special podcast mini-series. In the last 2 episodes, we discussed adaptation, loss and damage, and climate finance. In this episode, we'll have a conversation on climate change mitigation with 2 of our top experts on the topic, Robert Watt, Engagement Director at SEI, and Ploy Atcha-Kolwasit, a Research Fellow with SEI Asia. Now, we know that global emissions need to be almost halved by 2030 for the world to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. In March this year, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, published the synthesis report of its 6th assessment cycle, which stated definitively that we are off track to keeping 1.5 degrees within reach. So, Rob, let me turn to you first. What does keeping 1.5 degrees alive actually mean?
Thanks, Katie. I thought we can start by just trying to understand where this 1.5 degrees target comes from. And you have to go back really to the Paris Agreement in 2015, where there's a long-term temperature goal, and that establishes that we need to hold warming well below 2 degrees. And that means, that's the peak. That's where we can't go beyond that. And then we also need to make sure that we're pursuing every effort continuously towards 1.5 degrees. And really, that's the reason why 1.5 is established as a key policy goal for us. And as you say, the IPCC, the body that really synthesizes all the best science, is quite clear that we need to hold ourselves below 2 degrees because 2 degrees itself, warming of 2 degrees, isn't safe. And so the 1.5 degrees centigrade pathways that the IPCC has set out, that's actually the thing that's going to keep us in a safe area, somewhere below 2 degrees with a sort of 90% probability. And so there's a mixture here of like the 1.5 degrees, the 2 degrees, and the probability of staying there. But critically, we need to make sure that we're on a pathway to 1.5 to make sure that we never go beyond 2 degrees. So that's where it comes from, that Paris Agreement back in 2015. But I can also just briefly say that it has a real history within SEI. Back in 1990, one of the first climate reports that SEI published was all about temperature limits and indicators on climate change. And interesting, the other temperature target that we referred to back in 1990 was not 1.5, it was actually 1 degree of warming. So that's the history of it a little bit. Is it still alive? Yeah, the IEA has just released a report that said it's possible to get ourselves onto that 1.5 degree pathway. But the window is narrowing. So there's a time aspect here. We've got to do it now. The effort required to get onto that 1.5 degree pathway is getting higher and higher the longer we leave it. It's still possible, and the IEA has set out the sorts of efforts that will be required across economic sectors, within industries, and by governments.
Thanks, Rob. Many are suggesting that as that window is closing ever rapidly, should we still remain focused on limiting our emissions to keep 1.5 degrees alive, to keep that target within reach? Or do we need to also spend our efforts, our time really focusing, slightly switching tracks to thinking about how we prepare for a more warmer world in the future if we overshoot that target? Where should our focus be right now?
The quick answer is that you've got to do both, but we mustn't lose sight of reducing emissions. In the previous IPCC reports, they talked about the need to make sure that that we all understand that every degree, every percentage of a degree of avoided warming is worth it. I think that now we need to add to that every month, every week, every day that we can spend not exceeding 1.5 is worth it. Because of the consequences for people, for biodiversity, and for life on the planet. So I think that we must still maintain that focus. We can't avoid it. Making sure, as I said before, the IPCC is quite clear that if we want to stand a chance, a high degree of chance of keeping ourselves under that long-term temperature goal with 2 degrees as our hard ceiling, we've got to be focused on the mitigation. However, warming's going to happen, and warming is likely going to take us into danger zones, into zones that are going to really change the way in which crops are produced, the likelihood of extreme weather events. So yes, we need to prepare for that as well. Absolutely, invest in if you like, the adaptation to a warmer world. So it needs to be both. They go hand in hand.
Thanks, Rob. And Ploy, I'd love to bring you in here and to hear from your perspective. Why are we in danger of overshooting on this really critical 1.5 degree target that Rob has just outlined?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. So in May, the World Meteorological Organization issued a report saying that there's now a 66% chance that the global annual average temperature could exceed 1.5 degrees C in at least 1 year between now and 2027. This is driven by both the cumulative high levels of human-made greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere, as well as a naturally occurring strong El Nino event. But I think it's important to bear in mind that overshoot here means a temporary exceedance. As Robert was saying, what we do in the next few years will be absolutely crucial in determining whether or not we can still limit the long-term average warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And according to the 2022 UNEP emissions gap report, we can expect the 2023 update to be released a few days just after this podcast airs. Current government policies are projected to lead to long-term warming of 2.8 degrees C. Existing climate pledges and net zero targets, if implemented in full, could bring this down to 1.8 to 2.1 degrees C. But at our actual current pace of emissions, we could blow past the remaining so-called carbon budget of allowable carbon dioxide emissions for the 1.5 degrees C limit within the next 6 years. And so we really urgently need to ramp up both climate ambition and action. And with close to 90% of CO2 emissions stemming from fossil fuels, this means that we need a total transformation of our energy systems that will lead to rapid and substantial reductions in the global production and use of coal, oil, and gas in coordination with scaling up clean energy.
Thanks, Ploy. You mentioned net zero there. Perhaps for some of our listeners that might not be familiar with that phrase, can you just briefly explain to us, what does net zero mean?
So it's the cumulative amount of carbon dioxide emissions in our atmosphere that largely determines the level of long-term warming we're going to be seeing. And we now know that to stay within 1.5 degrees C of long-term warming, we need to almost halve CO2 emissions by 2030 from 2019 levels, and to get to net zero by around mid-century. The net here essentially means that some residual small levels of CO2 emissions could be potentially offset by carbon dioxide removal measures, or what's also known as negative emissions technologies. These include conventional methods that already exist, like afforestation and reforestation, as well as novel technologies being developed, like coupling carbon capture and storage to direct air capture or to bioenergy. But with the large-scale feasibility of these measures being increasingly called into question, and the fact that really they should be reserved for hard-to-transition sectors like steel, as Rob mentioned, or aviation, taking a precautionary approach would mean aiming to get to zero CO2 emissions by 2050.
And you've given us a really good snapshot there of where we stand at the moment here in 2023. Can you just situate this in a broader context? How far have we come on the mitigation agenda since the Paris Accord? Are there reasons for optimism? Should we be nervous about where we are in this current moment?
So before I respond to this question, I should give a quick disclaimer that climate mitigation is a vast topic, but I basically spend all my working and indeed most of my waking hours thinking about fossil fuel supply side policies. So that's what my answer will largely focus on. So the 2015 Paris Agreement was undoubtedly a landmark achievement in the history of international climate governance. It's helped to create this shared understanding, unifying goal of the need to limit long-term warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and to strive for 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, the text failed to make any mention of fossil fuels or coal, oil, or gas, even though these products are the very root cause of our climate crisis. And it would take another 6 years in 2021 before governments would finally commit to accelerate efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. But if you look past these negotiations and announced climate pledges to what's happening in real life, the signs are really worrying. Fossil fuel production and use, and consequently fossil CO2 emissions, reached record highs in the past 2 years. Meanwhile, governments' plans and projections for fossil fuel production, as stated in their most recent and publicly available national energy outlooks and strategies, when taken together, would lead to more than double the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 than global levels consistent with limiting long-term warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This metric, which we call the production gap, has remained largely unchanged since 2019 when we first began to track it. And so we find that countries' actual energy strategies remain vastly misaligned with their net zero pledges and the 1.5 degrees C limit. And according to government plans, global oil and gas production are projected to keep increasing until at least 2050. At the same time, other research has also shown that the committed CO2 emissions from existing fossil fuel extraction and combustion infrastructure will already exceed the remaining carbon budget for 1.5, meaning that investments in and developments of any new coal mines and oil and gas fields are incompatible with the 1.5C goal. And so as the recently published and updated net zero roadmap from the International Energy Agency showed, the rollout of clean energy technologies are helping to keep the path to 1.5 open, but we urgently need new policies to help facilitate a rapid, managed, and equitable phase out of fossil fuel production and use, alongside a massive scaling up of renewables, energy efficiency, and electrification, and other important climate mitigation efforts.
Thanks, Ploy. And you talked quite a bit there about phase down, phase out, and we hear, for those of us who are following the international climate change negotiations, we hear a lot about these phrases, and that semantics really matter in the context of these negotiations. So can you tell us a little more about why phrases like phase down or phase out matter, and what can we expect on this negotiation topic during the upcoming negotiations at COP28?
Certainly. So at COP26, the language governments finally agreed upon were to accelerate efforts towards, quote, the phase down of unabated coal power. There are three noteworthy aspects here. First, the choice of phase down over phase out. Second, the qualifying term unabated, which is currently poorly defined but generally implies the use of fossil fuels that is not coupled to carbon capture and storage. Third, it only covers coal power generation, not production, and oil and gas did not make the cut. All of this essentially amounts to leaving lots of wiggle room and loopholes for countries to keep producing fossil fuels, especially oil and gas. And the watering down of phase down from phase out started at COP26 due to pressure from India and China, the world's two largest producers of coal. India was widely portrayed as the villain in the media coverage, but many have pointed out the nuance around climate equity on such issues, whereby the emission of oil and gas means that many countries in the global north who are major oil and gas producers escaped the hook. And this battle line would be reiterated the following year at COP27, where India proposed to apply the phase down language to all fossil fuels and actually received support from more than 80 countries, including small island states and even major fossil fuel producers and consumers like the US, the EU, the UK, Canada, Australia, and Colombia. However, this proposal was opposed by Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Russia. Meanwhile, China and the African group of negotiators reportedly avoided taking a public stance, and ultimately the language stayed the same. With COP28 taking place in the UAE, one of the world's largest oil and gas producers, and with the COP28 president also being the CEO of the UAE's national oil company, ADNOC, it will be really, really interesting to see what will make it into the final COP decision text this year. The UNFCCC just released a report in early October highlighting what governments themselves believe would constitute important ways to ramp up climate ambition in light of this year's global stocktake of the Paris Agreement, and language around the phase out of all fossil fuels and phasing out fossil fuel production by 2050 appeared in this report, which is really pretty remarkable. So I can't wait to see what will happen at COP28.
Thanks, Ploy. Great, Rob, I'd like to bring you back in. So we've just heard from Ploy around the responsibilities of governments to mitigate climate change. But what is the role of industry on all this? And we're hearing lots of commitments to net zero, that term that Ploy outlined for us earlier. But are we really seeing the industrial transitions we need, and crucially at the pace we need?
So industry accounts for about 25% of all greenhouse gas emissions. I've been focusing mostly on heavy industries, which have formerly been called hard to abate, the ones that are really difficult to deal with because the emissions are really baked into the business model, sometimes into the actual processes. So think sectors like steel, cement, aluminium, shipping, aviation. These are the ones that we've been trying to look at and help to accelerate their transformation. The news is not great at the moment. Globally speaking, emissions aren't coming down in these heavy industry sectors. So they are responsible for a lot of emissions, and currently they're not coming down. But there are pockets of good news and good practice, and a lot of it is about scaling up what's happening at a sort of pilot project level, and also making sure that these technologies and investments aren't only happening in the rich world, but are also being deployed and shared with middle-income countries, emerging economies. Because actually, when it comes to looking at the future emissions from these industrial sectors, the largest growth is likely to be in middle-income countries who are still looking to develop their economies and provide essential services and infrastructure to their people. So industry really matters. There are some great examples of sectors and companies who are investing and in many cases the investments amount to sort of betting the whole company on a climate transition, which means moving away from, for example, using coal to produce steel, to either electrifying your steel production and using a circular scrap-based production methodology, or moving to a completely different system based on hydrogen production of steel. And these are really enormous transitions. Many of the investments in industry are long-term. And we also need to bear that in mind, that the shift does take some time, but the consequences can be quite quick. If you swap out coal for hydrogen, you go from high levels of greenhouse gas emissions to extremely low levels, provided, of course, your hydrogen is being produced with renewable electricity. So there are options on the table. We need to scale them out, need to invest and make sure they're available as broadly as possible. You also asked a little bit about all these net zero commitments. And I don't want to dampen the commitment and the leadership that has been shown by some companies to net zero. They have done they've used things like the Science-Based Targets Initiative to really evaluate all parts of their business and all scopes. So not only the emissions that they're directly responsible for, but things that within their value chain, they also are connected to what's called Scope 3 emissions. And those companies that have really done their homework and looked at this and used methodologies such as science-based targets, I think that they should be, held up as good examples. But the UN Secretary General was so worried about all these proliferation of declarations around being net zero aligned that he actually gathered a group of experts and they issued a report on called Integrity Matters. And there are now a set of principles that I think mean that we can both evaluate whether companies are true to their word when it comes to what they say about net zero, but also help companies make sure that they take the right steps in the right sequence to align themselves with net zero.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rob. And in a moment, I might come back to you to share just one or two examples of those pockets of good news, as you frame them, those good practices. But I just want to sort of push you a little bit more to say, if you could highlight just one or two key points, what do you think is absolutely critical if we're to encourage a race to the top in decarbonisation at a quicker pace? I mean, we've mentioned that, of course, it does take time to fully transform a business's operations, but given the speed at which we need to act, what one or two sort of critical ingredients to encourage a race to the top in decarbonising industry?
I'll give you two possible things that need to happen. One is that we still need to make sure that the business model can work, which means putting in place incentives and disincentives that enable companies to make the investments. On the incentive side, there's been a lot of investment going into Europe and into the United States. In Europe, there's been all sorts of support programs for innovation and scaling. In the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act has made it quite easy to see how much sort of a tax rebate, how much you're going to support, you're going to receive from the government when you're investing in carbon capture usage and storage or hydrogen production, to take a couple of examples. So yeah, there are incentives that are required, but we also need to disincentivize. And it has been quite clearly the case that in Europe, steel production has been influenced by setting a price on carbon. So actually saying, it's going to cost you if you continue to use coal and burn those fossil fuels. And so we need to have those signals very clear for the market and for decision makers in businesses. The other side that I think is really important is infrastructure. So a lot of these industries don't stand on their own. They are dependent on renewable energy availability at a predictable and competitive price. They are dependent then on that being distributed at the right time and in the right place. They're dependent on having the right sort of permitting and not taking too long to make decisions about the sorts of new plants, new investments that are required. So infrastructure really matters as well for many of these. And I'm actually going to add a third one, generally around finance. Financing needs to come in here, and it will follow a clear set of incentives, disincentives, and a sort of policy framework that means that infrastructure is in place, and that's critical. But we also need to combine both private and public finance for this, and in particular, that's critical for middle-income countries, we can't let them leave them behind and leave them stranded in a high emitting industry set of investments. So that's a critical component as well.
Thanks, Rob. And Ploy, I'd love to bring you in to this question as well on your perspectives and from your research and your experiences. Anything to add from what from the list of key actions that Rob just gave us? What can governments do to incentivize and support these efforts from businesses and from actors across society more broadly?
Yeah, I think Rob already covered a lot of the key points, but I think I just wanted to reiterate that I think market forces alone will not phase out fossil fuels fast enough at the rate we need or in an equitable manner. So governments do have a vital role to play here. State-owned companies control more than half of global fossil fuel production, and government policies and spending shape global energy markets in significant ways, as Rob mentioned. And so for the interested listener, I highly encourage you to go check out our Production Gap Report series at productiongap.org for more details, as well as the IEA's 2023 Net Zero Roadmap report. For now, I'll just highlight 4 key action points to kind of add on to what Rob has already covered really well. So first, I think we need to end the silence around fossil fuel production in climate policy making. Governments should commit to phasing out the emissions and production of all fossil fuels at COP28 and beyond. They should set near and long-term targets and design plans and policies to implement and coordinate the phase out of fossil fuels and phase in of renewable energy and storage systems. Just transition planning to ensure support for fossil fuel dependent communities and workers will be essential, as well as to avoid energy shortages, price spikes, and other potential negative impacts. Second, governments should redirect subsidies for fossil fuel production and consumption, which reached an all-time high of $1 trillion in 2022 towards clean energy. They should also increase transparency around their plans and support for fossil fuel production and how they align with national and international climate goals. Third, governments should stop approving investments and licenses for new fossil fuel exploration and extraction projects, especially in the global north. They will also need to accelerate the retirement of existing fossil fuel infrastructure. And finally, to ensure an equitable transition away from fossil fuels, higher income countries should lead the way and provide financial, technological, and capacity building support for lower income countries to diversify or leapfrog their economies and energy needs away from fossil fuels.
Thanks, Ploy. So we've just established there is an awful lot of work that needs to be done, but where should we look to for best practices, good examples? There is a lot of focus at the moment on those net zero targets to 2050. There is a fear that both governments and businesses have, frankly, too much leeway to kick the can down the road. And there is a real need to scrutinize, as Rob, you highlighted, their commitments, how they actually intend to decarbonize by 2050. Now, we know the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, has established the Mitigation Work Programme to drive more urgent action by 2030. But I wonder, whose best practices should the world be taking note of? And I'm going to ask you both this question. Rob, perhaps as you mentioned, the pockets of good news, I can turn to you first, and then Ploy, would love to hear any success stories or good practices from your side too.
Thanks, Katie. So I'll start off with one example in the Nordic region, which is the 14 climate partnerships that the Danish government, together with private sector, put in place to identify 70% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030. Now, this is a good example of trying to make sure that you combining the policy making enabling environment, the muscle of the public's purse with decisions in the private sector, and aligning those, raising ambition, the private sector to making demands on the public sector, the public sector raising its expectations. And similar approach of this planning and road mapping, not only for 2050, but for sort of near-term reductions and pathways, has been carried out in Sweden in its road mapping of 27 sectors. So I think that there are a couple of good examples, and they're not the only ones, but of using this planning and road mapping, setting goals, and collaborating between the public and private sectors. Then, if you look at examples of companies that are sort of really leading the way, I think that there is an example of a cement company in India called Dalmia Cement. Dalmia is really committed to trying to reduce its emissions. So what it's investing in is moving away from fossil fuels in some of its production processes, and using waste and biomass in the heating. Then on the other side, they're also changing the components in the makeup, if you like, of the cement, again to reduce the emissions in the chemical processes of cement production. Great examples in India there. And then on the steel side, there's all the huge investment that's taking place in the north of Sweden to accelerate the hydrogen-based production of steel. And those are demonstrations that it can be done. It can be done if you've got the right set of circumstances, with the right infrastructure, the right leadership, the renewable energy that's available.
So to date, few governments and companies have been willing to acknowledge that we must also rapidly reduce the production of all fossil fuels to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C and to commit to such efforts. Notable exceptions include governments that have joined the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, being led by Denmark, an intergovernmental effort to facilitate the managed phase out of oil and gas production, and those who have endorsed the civil society-led Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which include many Pacific Island member states and the European Parliament so far. However, for these efforts to be successful, we really need the major fossil fuel producers of the world to also get on board and join these first movers, these emerging leaders, and for there to be international dialogue and cooperation on sharing the limited budget for fossil fuel production in a carbon-constrained world.
Thank you, Ploy. Thank you both so much. I have one last question before we wrap up today's episode, and that is, of course, on COP28. So I would love to hear from both your perspectives what you think COP28 must deliver. So what discussions and agreements are needed to deliver on the ambitions of the Paris Accord by 2030 with regards to climate change mitigation? And I'll turn to Rob first of all, and then Ploy to end us.
I have one that's perhaps on the cards and one that's a little bit more left field. So the one that's on the cards, I think, is a huge financial and policy commitment to tripling the amount of renewable capacity from now until 2030. That's something that the COP presidency has highlighted, and it's supported by the latest IEA roadmap to net zero. And I think that that's doable. They've flagged it, and I think that they might be able to bring the right players together. But critically, it needs to be backed up with money and with a plan, and it needs also be deployed in a way that makes sure that it's going to the right places, not just to the easy wins and the easy bets, but also some of the tougher places in the world. Then my left field one is one that Ploy's been talking and has been researching all about reducing the supply of fossil fuels. And there's been various initiatives powering past coal agendas, all about making sure that we wean ourselves off coal in the production of electricity. I'm really keen for us to wean ourselves off coal in the production of steel. And I'd love it for this COP to begin the conversation that means that we set an end date for unabated coal use in the production of steel. And that we really begin a conversation and countries start saying, yeah, by this date, no more coal, certainly no more unabated coal in steel production. It's not on the cards yet. It'd be great to start the conversation.
Thanks, Rob. And Ploy?
Yeah, I mean, great points from Rob. I totally agree. And I mean, given that I basically focus on fossil fuels, that is what I would love to see in terms of the developments at COP28. I mean, for almost 30 years of negotiation, governments have shied away from saying what I like to jokingly call the F word of climate policy making, fossil fuels. So to some extent, this is understandable, right? I mean, fossil fuels have powered our society for over a century. And so it's not surprising that most governments still view coal, oil, and gas as sources of geopolitical power, energy security, and development. But fundamentally, it is energy that is central to the fabric of our society, not fossil fuels. And the science is crystal clear that we must phase out coal, oil, and gas production and use to ensure a safe and livable present and future. And so as a first step, governments should acknowledge and commit to phasing out the emissions and production of all fossil fuels at COP28. Failing to accept the true nature of the challenge at hand is only going to make the problem harder and harder to solve, as evidenced by the lack of progress over the past 30 years. And it's only resulting in the need for increasingly ambitious and unprecedented actions and transformations to the way we power our society. And so I really hope that when governments convene for the 28th time at these annual UN climate negotiations, against a backdrop of increasingly devastating climate impacts, which are affecting lives and livelihoods worldwide, governments will finally have the courage to commit to phasing out all fossil fuels.
That's all for today's episode. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the podcast, share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To learn more about SEI and to access more resources and materials, head over to SEI.org and follow us on Twitter at SEI Research. Let's connect on the next episode. Thanks for listening.